Sizing up Apple Silicon. Hello, I'm Ken Ray, welcoming you to episode 193 of The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. The biggest news to come out of WWDC 20 was Apple's plan to move the Mac from Intel processors to a self-designed solution called Apple Silicon. Today we'll look at some differences between the two architectures, what the move will mean for people outside of Apple, and some of the security implications. Because that is what we do on The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. A little over a month ago, Apple shook up its own world when it announced a big move for the Mac. For nearly 15 years, computers from Apple have had Intel inside. By the end of this year, though, Apple will start phasing Intel out of the Mac, moving instead to ARM-based processors that Apple is designing itself. Nick Leone writes for the SecureMac site. He's been looking into Apple Silicon, and he joins us to talk about it now. I guess let's just start. I don't know if this is starting at the beginning or starting before the beginning to the beginning. x86 versus ARM. What's the difference between the two architectures?
So Intel's x86 architecture is what's called a CISC architecture. That's CISC. And ARM chips are built on a RISC architecture. That's RISC. And CISC stands for Complex Instruction Set Computer Architecture. RISC is Reduced Instruction Set Computer Architecture. And there are some differences, but like the basic difference is just how instructions get passed to the CPU. Like how the CPU is told what operations it needs to execute. So CISC architectures let you give the CPU slightly more complex instructions. So you can tell the processor to do something using like way fewer lines of code than you could with a RISC architecture. With a RISC architecture, you'd tell the CPU to perform like maybe the same action, but you would break the instructions down into like all of the separate steps.
In the thing that you wrote for SecureMac, actually, I really like the illustration you gave. You said in CISC architecture, you might say blank, whereas in RISC architecture, you might say close your eyes, open your eyes.
Yeah, right, like something like that, right? It's sort of RISC kind of painfully spells out everything for the CPU, whereas there's some more consolidation in a CISC architecture. So, like, but what is that actually? That's what that means for computers. What does that actually mean for human beings? RISC architectures tend to be more efficient. That makes them ideal for like low power environments, things like mobile devices or embedded devices, embedded systems, sorry. CISC architectures, they've sometimes been seen as more like developer friendly, since the way they work lets you write more compact programs.
So then will developers have to do anything different to program for Apple Silicon Macs?
I watched some of the developer sessions at this year's WWDC, and Apple seems like it's going to great lengths to reassure developers that this change isn't going to make their lives, noticeably harder. I don't know whether that will actually turn out to be the case. I guess we'll see. But they are providing tools for developers that do things like automatically translate code written for x86 into something that's going to work on the Apple Silicon architecture, right? The ARM architecture. They've released developer documentation that will help devs port their x86 apps to an ARM version. So I think the hope is that the transition is going to be relatively painless.
No, it's interesting because, painless though it may be, there is still, a transition. Things seem to be working for the Mac today. Why make this switch?
There's likely a few reasons. For one thing, there have been rumors that Apple wasn't really happy about quality control issues at Intel in recent years. And I think there was a report, I think this was just last week, out by CNBC, that said Intel had to delay the release of its new 7-nanometer chip due to some production issues. The headline was something like, "Why Apple was right to ditch Intel," which is a little bit harsh, but it kind of lends credence to that speculation that Intel was having these production issues that Apple was not happy about. And I guess that kind of fits together with another reason for the change. whenever it can, Apple likes to do stuff in-house. Right? They're this classic example of a company opting for that vertical integration model. So if they go that route, if they're making their own chips, that they don't have to worry about Intel's problems, whether those are production problems or quality problems. And they're not going to be constrained by some other company in terms of what they can do with their own products, or in terms of like when they can release them.
Okay, so that explains the why of it. Why now?
I think it's probably just the case that Apple feels ready, right? So they've been making chips for the iPhone and the iPad for like around 10 years now using the ARM architecture. And they've gotten really, really good at it. So they now have this mature silicon engineering division that has this great track record. And I think if you're Apple right now, you're probably feeling pretty confident that you can go out and build your own processors for the Mac and maybe even do it better than Intel.
So the piece that you wrote for SecureMac, in that you said that a lot of people think of ARM processors as less powerful than x86, which is kind of funny because, there are apps in the App Store that are on par with what we would think of as, being on more powerful machines. I'm thinking specifically of like, console level games and things like that.
Right. I think that perception has more to do with the fact that historically, Intel was just the company that happened to dominate the processor market for more powerful computers. And ARM chips, because they're very energy efficient, they kind of became the natural choice for low power environments for things, again, like mobile devices or embedded systems, which, are not as powerful. And so they kind of got associated with those. But yeah, no, like you say, there's nothing to stop anybody from building something extremely fast using the ARM architecture. In fact, right now, I think the world's fastest supercomputer is, Fugaku in Japan. Runs on the ARM processor architecture. And actually, like if you go to ARM's website, they really, really want people to know that. It's like on the banner. It's the first thing you see when you go to the website. So yeah, it's possible to use the ARM architecture to build tremendously powerful, tremendously fast machines.
See, there are two things I think about when you say that. The first is Apple has said that they're going to make the transition to the ARM architecture. Well, Apple Silicon, because they don't say ARM, but they're going to make the transition to the ARM architecture within, I think it's like 2 to 3 years. And they just came out with the Mac Pro like a year ago or less. So, they're banking on their most powerful machines being able to run on this. The other thing I'm thinking about, too, is, as far as whether you can do powerful things with the ARM architecture, PA Semi, which is the processor maker that Apple bought in 2008, and it's basically the way that Apple got into designing and making its own ARM processors. They were making chips for the military. So, it wasn't like not a customer, I would say, that would skimp. Not somebody that you're going to go with underpowered stuff.
Right. Yeah. And again, like back then, you were hearing speculation that's kind of similar to what we're hearing now about the change to ARM for Mac. So the acquisition of that company had to do a lot with Apple being dissatisfied with the performance and the efficiency of Intel's Atom chips. Atom was Intel's low-power chip for handheld devices. And it wasn't giving Apple the kind of battery life they wanted. It wasn't efficient enough, right? So at the time, a lot of Apple's competitors were basing their device designs, around what Intel chips could support. And again, that kind of didn't sit well with Apple. They were trying to innovate. They were trying to do things to stand out from the pack. And it brings us back to that same issue of like Apple doesn't want to, or Apple doesn't like to, if it doesn't have to, have some other company's products dictating what they can and can't do with their own products, whether that's, in terms of design or development or a release cycle or whatever.
So we've talked about Apple wanting more control over all aspects of its devices. And, that's great for Apple. Yay for Apple. I want to talk about what's in it for the consumer, though, from a performance perspective. I think the average Mac user wants to know, will the switch to Apple Silicon improve performance for, the Mac they're going to go out and plunk a few $1,000s on?
Apple definitely seems to think so. So at the developer talks at WWDC, the company highlighted a couple of things about Apple Silicon that they say is going to make the Mac better, faster, higher performance. And the first thing is asymmetric multiprocessing, AMP. And the second one, it has to do with the way the CPU and the GPU share resources. So let's start with AMP. Like right now, Intel Macs have multi-core CPUs, right? Like if you go to the Apple Store to check out a new Mac, or if you go online, you're going to see the various options for Intel Macs. You're going to see, dual core i3, quad core, or like 6-core or 8-core. Or, if you have a lot of money and you want to drop $50,000 on a computer, you can buy a Mac Pro with 28 cores or something, right? And all that means is that the CPU has several or multiple processing units. So it's like having multiple CPUs within your CPU. And that allows the CPU to perform more tasks at the same time. But the thing is, with the Intel chips that the Mac is using now, right? All of those cores will have roughly the same specs in terms of performance. So you have cases where a program, for example, maybe needs to do something that doesn't require much in the way of CPU resources. But then there are going to be other times when it needs to do something that is, genuinely resource intensive, that requires like max performance, right? And at the moment, no matter what it is that an app needs to get done, that work is going to be sent to a core that's more or less the same as all the other cores. And that's not ideal, right? That's not optimal. Like I kind of think of it in terms of if you only had one car and it was a Ferrari, right? That's great. And that would be wonderful if you needed to like race to the airport to catch a flight or something. But if you're just driving around town to buy milk and eggs and whatever, like it's kind of way more car than you need, and you're going to burn a lot of gas, right? So AMP is Apple's solution to this problem. The new Apple Silicon Macs are going to have this mix of high performance cores for those times when apps need resource intensive, high performance. And they're also going to have these power efficient cores, which apps can use to accomplish less intensive tasks without wasting resources. So in terms of the end result for the user, it's going to be a Mac that does all of its computational work optimally, which should result in improved performance and improved efficiency.
That is kind of a crazy thing to think about, because like if I do video editing, then obviously I'm glad for, the power of the Core i whatever I have in my MacBook. If I'm writing in Pages though, or just making a note in text editor, that's a fascinating, it's a fascinating look at it. Now, is that similar to the CPU, GPU resource sharing that you mentioned earlier?
I guess it's similar in the sense that the purpose is to avoid wasted effort. So, like what you have right now, a lot of Intel Macs have a CPU and they have a discrete graphics processing unit, as a discrete GPU that handles the graphics. And the CPU and the GPU will have they'll each have their own separate memory area, right? So where the problem is, well, not the problem, but it's just the way it works right now, is sometimes the CPU needs to access graphical resources, like maybe images or textures or geometry data. And that may be stored in the GPU's memory. Now, the CPU can access that data, but not directly, right? So first, it has to be copied over into the CPU memory, and then it can be accessed, right? But that extra step adds a bit of, what they call, computational overhead, right? It's a little bit of extra work that has to be done, right? So what Apple Silicon Macs are going to do is combine the CPU and the GPU into a single system. So they'll be working on the same memory. They'll be working over the same memory. And if the CPU needs some graphics resource, it can just go get it from its own memory without all the extra work, without the extra steps. And that too, should result in better performance.
We'll tackle the security side of Apple Silicon in a moment, but first a word about MacScan 3 from SecureMac. Chances are you're doing more with your computer today than you were a few months ago. thanks to all the staying in and social distancing. I'm not saying you're doing anything risky with your computer. I will say, though, now would be a horrible time for anything bad to happen to it. Of course, any time would be a horrible time for something bad to happen to your computer, which is why you need a good anti-malware solution like MacScan 3. MacScan 3 is a great defense against malicious software attacks aimed at your Mac. It's developed by SecureMac, trusted names in computer security and developers of exceptional security software for the Mac for over 20 years. MacScan 3 detects and removes Mac malware, catches keyloggers, removes tracking cookies, and provides full-range or targeted scanning, all without crowding up your hard drive or slowing down your machine. Sign up for a free 30-day trial today at securemac.com/MacScan. Then once you decide to buy for less. You can take a little off the subscription to MacScan 3 with offer code CHECKLIST. Try it first. Watch it kick those tracking cookies to the curb. Then when you're ready to buy for less with offer code CHECKLIST at securemac.com/MacScan. And now more of our conversation with Nick Leone. So, this being a security show produced by SecureMac, we do have to talk about, funny enough, security. Privacy and security are features that Apple takes very seriously. In fact, Apple has referred to privacy as a human right. So, yeah, they must think that Apple Silicon will be at least as secure as Intel processors. I'm wondering, with this transition to Apple Silicon, what does Apple say about the security side?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting the way they've characterized these changes. They're basically saying Apple Silicon Macs are going to bring many of the security protections of the iPhone to the Mac, but in a way that isn't going to fundamentally change what the Mac is for the user. So one thing that Apple Silicon Macs are going to have is something called kernel integrity protection. And that's something that iPhones and iPads have right now. Like quick reminder, kernel is the core code of an operating system. It's the heart of the OS. It handles like memory management, task management, provides basic functionality for all the apps on your system. And so the kernel is really, really important. And anything that can interfere with it can create serious security issues. Whenever Apple releases a round of security updates, what often kind of jumps out at you as most important is anything that has to do with patching a kernel vulnerability. Because again, any issue there in the kernel is potentially serious from a security standpoint. And Apple generally will take anything having to do with the kernel very, very seriously. I don't know if you remember last year at WWDC, when they introduced Catalina, they announced that they were going to be getting rid of KEXTs, kernel extensions. And the reason they gave is that they were doing this to improve security, right? So KEXTs are used by developers to add functionality to the kernel, right? They help with things like drivers, networking, endpoint security, right? So they're really important, but Apple viewed them as this potential security risk, which is like nothing against developers, not to distrust developers or anything. It's just from a security standpoint, the fewer people you have doing things in the kernel, the better. So they wound up replacing KEXT. Well, it's not quite replaced yet, but like KEXTs are on the way out, replacing them with something called system extensions, which are basically supposed to provide the same functionality to developers that KEXTs do, but they don't actually affect the kernel.
Okay, so then what is kernel integrity protection?
Okay, so kernel integrity protection is this protection that's it's built into the hardware, and what it does is when you boot your computer and when the kernel is initialized, it freezes the kernel code. Basically, it makes the kernel code immutable once it's been initialized, and so that means that while it's running, the kernel can't be changed, and no additional kernel code can be loaded. And the reason that matters for security is that there are certain kinds of attacks that rely on code being injected into a running kernel. And so kernel integrity protection will help to prevent these. So like a second way that Apple Silicon Macs will improve security is through a protection called write XOR execute. Write XOR execute, it's basically a memory protection. It's a restriction that says chunks of memory can be writable or they can be executable, but they can't be both at the same time. And that's all that XOR means in computing. It's exclusive OR. It's the idea that something can be A or it can be B, but it can't be both A and B together. And so write XOR execute means memory will either be writable or executable, but not writable and executable.
Okay, why is writable or executable less safe than writable and executable?
It's dangerous for a section of memory to be both writable and executable at the same time, because a bad guy could potentially write some malicious code to an area of memory that's intended for data, but then execute it. And the problem is a lot of apps include something called just-in-time compilers, JIT compilers, right? And these are used to translate certain kinds of code into like a format that a computer can execute. So, for example, web browsers have JIT compilers that handle JavaScript. It handles the JavaScript found in web pages. But the problem is JIT compilers often need memory to be both writable and executable, which again is like not secure. So what Apple is going to do is enforce write XOR execute, but they're also going to create an API that will allow memory to be toggled very quickly back and forth between being writable and being executable. So the result is JIT compilers will still be able to function, they'll still be able to do their work, but will eliminate that writable and executable vulnerability at the same time. And I guess the last big security enhancement that Apple Silicon Macs are going to bring is pointer authentication. And that's something that's coming directly as a result of the switch to ARM. And it's something that already exists on iPhones.
Okay, and what is that?
All right, so like under the hood of a computer, when the CPU is getting its instructions to perform operations, right, it's always being told like where exactly in memory it has to go. So go to this memory address, execute the instruction you find there, or go to that memory address, retrieve the data you find stored there, right? And the way a computer knows where to go is a memory pointer. And all that is it's a sequence of bits that references a specific location in memory.
Okay, so the pointer literally points to where the CPU needs to look.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The problem is there are certain kinds of vulnerabilities that will allow bad actors, hackers, whatever, to give the system the wrong pointer and tell it to go to a place in memory that it's not supposed to go. And so that might cause a crash. But under the right conditions, hackers can use malicious pointers to force the computer to execute instructions or to even execute malicious code. And like worst case, that could result in them getting remote admin access to your computer. So in the ARM architecture, you've got these 64-bit pointers, right? These long pointers, right? But the actual memory address referenced by the pointer doesn't use all of those bits. You have these extra bits, these leftover bits. And so ARM decided to use those extra bits to store what's called a pointer authentication code. And it's basically it's like a digital signature, right? It's generated cryptographically, it's tacked onto the pointer, and what it does is it verifies that the source of the pointer is authentic. So before the system uses a pointer, before the system listens to the pointer and goes to that place in memory, right, it can first check the pointer authentication code to make sure that it's valid, to make sure that the pointer is validly signed. And in other words, is coming from a trusted source, right? If it isn't signed or if it's not validly signed, the system just doesn't use the pointer. So it might still be possible for a bad actor to send a malicious pointer, but they won't be able to send a digitally signed or a properly signed malicious pointer, right? They won't be able to send a pointer that the computer will actually use, which should really harden the new Macs against this kind of attack.
All right, I got one more question, and this is not a security question. This is a A potential buyer's remorse question. This is a peace of mind question. If somebody's thinking about a new Mac, should they get one now, or should they wait for the Apple Silicon rollout?
I got one now.
Oh, okay.
I just bought a new Mac like a month ago, or a month before WWDC. Although I kind of knew that ARM Macs were coming, and it didn't bother me much. I guess it's one of those things that everybody's got to decide for themselves. But if the question is, is there a danger that my new Intel Mac that I buy today will be obsolete by the end of next year? No, you don't have to worry about that at all. So a couple of reasons. Like first of all, the transition to Apple Silicon Macs is not happening overnight. Like the first ones aren't even going to be available until the end of this year. So you still got months until that happens. And the entire transition, I think they gave a timeline of about 2 years from when it was announced, right? So, it's still a ways off before it's even complete. And like right now, Apple still has Intel Macs in the pipeline that they haven't even released yet, right? So Intel Macs aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And in terms of support or compatibility, Apple itself is committed to releasing new versions of macOS that are going to work on both Intel and Apple Silicon Macs. And they haven't said how long they'll do this, so it's pretty much indefinitely, for the foreseeable future. And like we said before, Apple's they're doing everything they can to make it easy on app developers to write apps that'll run on both architectures. So I don't think there's any reason to fear that like your favorite apps are going to just stop working if you have an Intel Mac, right? At least not anytime soon. So I don't know. I guess in the end, like if you want to wait until the end of the year to get a new Apple Silicon Mac, okay, fine. But like if you really need a new Mac now because you're starting a new job or starting university or something, I wouldn't let the change put you off at all. Unless you plan on the Mac that you buy this month to be the last one you'll ever buy, or you want to hang on to it for like 10 years or something. But otherwise, I don't think you have anything to worry about, right? I would suspect that for most people, myself included, if they're buying an Intel Mac now, by the time they're likely to run into any kind of support or compatibility issues, they'll probably just be ready to buy a new Mac anyway.
I mentioned earlier that Nick writes for the SecureMac site. If you go to securemac.com/news, you can keep up with some of the stuff he's keeping up with. That's securemac.com/news. You can also follow him on Twitter, Nick Leon Ruiz. That's NickLeonRuiz. Nick Leon Ruiz. And thanks again to Nick Leon for joining us today. Of course, if you're looking for more shows just like this one, securemac.com/checklist is the place to go. There you'll find notes for this show, for the last show, for the one before that, all the way back to the first one, and you can listen to every show there as well. It all starts in one place, securemac.com/checklist. If you have a question you would like to ask or a topic you'd like to hear us hit, our email address is checklist@securemac.com. The address again is checklist@securemac.com. And if you can't remember that, please do remember this. You're listening to The Checklist, brought to you by SecureMac. And we'll talk to you soon.